Revenge films.
My name is Winnie Stewart. 2 years after getting married, I started to live with my in-laws. Mr. Bond, my father-in-law, became a little fragile with his health. And Mrs. Bond said she was worried she might not be able to cope alone if something happened to her husband.
Of course, this is only temporary. Once Dad becomes healthy again, we'll go back to our own lives. So would you be patient until then, honey?
Be patient. Darling, your parents are so kind, so I don't mind living with them at all. I'd responded to Dale like that at the time, but since our life together, Mrs. Bond suddenly switched personalities and started giving me a hard time. She'd get picky over lots of things, like my cooking and how it tastes plain, and the laundry and how it's hung outside to dry. I was able to cope with it if I considered it as a way of helping be a better housewife. But when her older sister stopped by, those words became quite something else, not at all like the potential words of encouragement. You see, Madame Bond loves arguments, and whenever I would argue with my mother-in-law, a coy look would spread across her face. Even when I gave birth to a daughter, the two of them would say, "You stupid coward! How can you call yourself a woman if you can't bear a son?" The insults were impressive. One day, though, the tables turned. It was on the day I had surgery because of a certain illness. When I came to, Dale and Mr. Bond were just standing there with huge smiles. Of course, Mrs. Bond, who I despised with a passion, wasn't present. I knew she wouldn't stop by, but at least it's quiet here, was what I'd thought. But then I heard something shocking from the two guys. Mrs. Bond, whom I thought me a nuisance, stopped by the surgery room numerous times during the procedure. She'd apparently grabbed the doctors and nurses. "Will she be saved? I will not forgive you if you don't do everything that is necessary. Please, tell me, how is she doing?" Again and again, she would visit the operating room with a worried look on her face. The doctor had gotten exasperated, and one of the nurses warned her, "Please, madam, you have to calm down."
Mom, I told you that the surgery wasn't anything complicated, did I? It'll be fine. Just leave it to the doctors.
Dale tried hard to console her, but "Even doctors are human, dear. You don't know what will happen," she retorted to him rather rashly. Mr. Bond, suspicious, then asked,
Hang on. Didn't you say once you didn't like Winnie very much?
All he got as a response was, and she never met his eyes, as she added, "It's not that I'm worried. Good grief, getting sick right when everyone was tired with their own jobs. Oh, so tiresome. Honestly, that girl." She was apparently as red as a tomato as she tried to convince them. I couldn't believe it at the time, and it led me to very twisted thinking like, yeah, I bet she wanted me dead, so she deliberately tried to muck about the doctor's business, right? Even after I left the hospital, Mrs. Bond was still harsh with me. But I doubt you know this already since you're so naive. But for your illness, this is a good medicine. She would leave stacks of books about various illnesses in the living room, and I personally don't care what happens to you, but my son and granddaughter would be very unfortunate, right? Whenever I got ill again, while she would still say some harsh things, she was a dear in that she cared for me and my daughter. Around then, I began to realize that she wasn't hard on because it was her nature, but that she didn't want me to know she was a lonely, embarrassed person. So I brushed off the harsh words with a heart and smile. It wasn't like I'd accepted every nasty thing she'd say to me, but it became easier to accept such a mother-in-law. Since then, my illness was cured completely. But 6 months later, Mr. Bond passed away. He was such a kind soul who comforted me after his dry wife and who took care of his granddaughter. In addition, whenever his wife seemed tired, he would tell her,
"How about relaxing your shoulders, dear?"
and massage her shoulders and back. I realized how much they loved each other, and I found the marriage of my dreams therein. After his passing, Mrs. Bond often sat in front of his shrine, entranced. Her harsh words halted abruptly, too. She just sat there without energy, without happiness. I tried to get her to say something by deliberately breaking a dish by accident. Normally, I would be met with the, "You can't wash a single dish, can you?" and the, "Oh, you're so useless." But this time, she only answered with, "Winnie, dear, are you hurt?" Additionally, in July, she muttered to me, "I'm so sorry for everything until now." Her voice was so quiet, so devoid of her usual energy. She'd changed so drastically. Dale and I got a bit panicky and tried everything to console her, but her time in front of Mr. Bond's shrine got even longer. What was rare at their time, they got married after such a passionate lovers' relationship, and they were inseparable. During these hard times, Madame Bond often stopped by to visit. Her objective was to get Mrs. Bond and I to argue again, and she tried her darndest to make that happen. "Why, Hope, honey, you used to show your useless daughter-in-law who was boss of the house. Now, didn't you? Why aren't you saying anything? Oh, could it be that she gave you a hard time?" But no matter how much she pestered Mrs. Bond, the only response she ever got was, "Leave me alone," and was shut out. Frustrated by how inexistent action her sister was taking, she cried. "What are you gonna do? You're fine with just letting her run wild without a care in the world? Not only will your son be under her control, but your own house." The crassness was exasperating, but Mrs. Bond, with what she had left, cried, "Please, just stop," and just broke down. And that became Madame Bond's new daily schedule. At first, I thought she wanted to get back her sister's energy with her ecstatic bickering, out of some family spirit, but I was wrong. She told me, "Your mother-in-law, she was spilling harsh words on you before, wasn't she? Well now, want me to fill in that void you must have?" Then I realized, so she wasn't worried about her sister, but only that she wanted to see us argue. That made me sad, needless to say. And then, "Hey, miss, she's vulnerable. Attack now. Now's your chance." When she whispered this bullshit to me, something inside me snapped. I immediately slapped Madame Bond. She exclaimed, "You gangster!" At that, Mrs. Bond burst into the living room, and then, "Hope, dear, it's finally come. This bitch has finally showed her true colors. Look, she hit me." Oh, how her voice sounded furious. Mrs. Bond quietly replied, "Please stop this. Please. Tell me to die, and I will, I say." She broke down, and then Madame Bond said, "Well, go on, die then. See if I give a good goddamn." She actually kicked the poor crying woman. Upon seeing this, I screamed, "What the frick are you doing to my mother?" And before I knew it, I crashed a nearby beer bottle against her head. The bottle broke into pieces as easily as sugar glass, and a puzzled Madame Bond turned around to look at me. I will use a wine bottle next." At that stupid nonsense, she shot out of the house, screaming in agony. I asked Mrs. Bond what was wrong with that bitch, and she said maybe she never approved of peaceful families. That's why, whenever my mother-in-law and I would argue, she would be in such a good mood. I couldn't ask for many details, but as I'd thought, Madame Bond had lost her own love in the war and married someone else. Her husband treated her like a slave, and she was jealous of getting married for love, of having children with someone you love, and on top of this, of multiple generations living in the same house. When Mrs. Bond was saying nasty things, the only thing on her mind was that she didn't have her son to be taken away from her. She apologized for me for not noticing that my aunt-in-law had climbed aboard and were bullying me together. So I told her, "How about we be even with this?" and slapped her in the face. She was dazed at first, but then, without even giving it a second thought, she said, "Thank you, dear," as she cried tears of joy. Personally, the fact that I could slap my despicable in-laws for what they did made me feel so much better, and everything was resolved afterwards, too. Now my mother-in-law is slowly going back to her old self, but without the nasty insults. And Madame Bond would make herself scarce upon seeing me. But I'm also not much of a strong person, and I'm worried that some side effects from being hit with a beer bottle would later float to the surface. But when I asked my husband, it was something done often at a party performance, and wasn't much of a big deal. But a bottle's a bottle. I'm living in a bit of fear these days, but so is Madame Bond. So perhaps that's also a compromise of sorts. With Mr. Bond now gone, my mother-in-law said, "I can now do the things that I can do myself, dear. You must treasure your life together." She hoped to send us back to our own lives, but one look at her would make anyone reluctant. This situation could happen to me and to anyone else, after all. It might be a bit hypocritical, but while I can't forgive for all she's done yet, I'm seriously considering living together, with a bit more understanding between the two of us.
How was today's video? If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Stay tuned for more.